everyone. Welcome to this week's edition of Carolina Poets. My name is Kimberly Simms, and I will be your host for tonight. I am so excited about this lineup that we have for you all. This is going to be our first Cowboy poetry themed poetry event, and we really have a stellar lineup that we're going to be sharing with you. We have Tom Kerlin here and Sam Renken, both very renowned Cowboy poets who both now live in Georgia. So we're still excited that they could just visit with us today here in the Carolinas virtually. This is Carolina Poets. We are here every Thursday night at 7 o'clock, and each week we feature 3 different poets with Carolina connections. Next week, please definitely tune in, put it on your calendar, because next week we will be having Richard Garcia, Dorian Lau, and Joseph Millar visiting with us next Thursday night. So definitely please check out our Facebook page, like the Facebook page, like this video. You can share it to your stream. You can also check us out on our YouTube channel. We are actually going to be doing kind of a big launch of our YouTube channel, Carolina Poets, in the next few weeks. So definitely please head over to YouTube after this video if you're not already there. And please like our page, Carolina Poets. We're trying to get up to 100 subscribers so that we can get our custom URL and do all that fun technology stuff. But thank you everyone for joining us here tonight. I want to give a shout out to my co-curators. We've got Derek Berry and Andrew K. Clark, and together with myself, Kimberly Simms, we book the poets each week here on Poetry Goes Viral and take turns hosting. And it's just been such a joy to provide this opportunity for poets when the pandemic hit and everyone's book tours got canceled, including some of our own. That was really concerning. So we've been really excited to provide this opportunity for poets to get back in touch with their audiences. So I think I've chatted long enough to give everybody an opportunity to get online. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our first poet tonight. But as I said, we're going to be having Tom Kerlin and Sam Renken. Jerry Warren was going to be joining us, but he is literally in the field tending his cows right now, as a good cowboy poet should be doing. So these are all not only cowboy poets, but working cowboys as well, which I think is pretty damn awesome. So we're going to try and get Jerry back when the days get a little bit shorter. We'll try and get him back on here to share some of his poetry because he's really a lot of fun. So the first poet I'm going to introduce is Sam Renken. I actually met Sam when we were both doing our master's degrees at Clemson University. And that's kind of his Carolina connection. He is a wonderful poet. But he is actually a Nebraska native. He's a wizard of words. He's a constant observer and a potential godfather of the hipsters. Sam's work aligns with and has been published in a Nebraska anthology besides the likes of Willa Cather, his adored mentor, Bill Cloughburn, and Ted Kuzer, former U.S. Poet Laureate. He holds an MA from Clemson as well as an MFA. His first collection of poems, Where to Start, won the Holland Prize from Logan House Press and is in its 3rd printing after selling over 20,000 copies. While in Wyoming, he also received a Wyoming Arts Council grant to study the extensive collection of archived Pony Express documents housed at the university. His experiences at the Cathedral Home merged with his research of the Pony Express to create a stunning and sometimes shocking narrative set of poems currently on the presses, which I'm super excited about that collection about the Pony Express, Sam. So I'm going to go ahead without any further ado and bring Sam Renken to the stage. Sam, how are you? I think you're on and you're good. Can you? I think he's got his mic muted maybe, so we're going to give him a second to readjust here. We're all on technology, I think, trying things for the first time. Sam, were you able to get it going again? Might be a headphone issue. But anyway, Sam and I, as I was saying, have done several poetry readings together in the past. We've read in Greenville, South Carolina. We've done some readings in Clemson. He's now living in McDonough, Georgia, with his beautiful wife and their 2 children. Still spending a little time working with his horses, like a good cowboy should. And Sam, if you do have a technical problem, you can always also jump on your phone, which I've done before. Are you good?
I can't hear you.
Oh, you can't hear me, but I can hear you. So I may be on my side. So we'll see. We can hear you just fine. So I'm going to go ahead and bring you on because we can hear you just fine. So I'm going to step back, and your mic is working great.
Okay,
You
awesome.
good? Okay, I'm going to
I'm
step back.
good. Hey, thanks for having me here. I'm going to start with a poem that I wrote when Kimberly and I were in grad school together. And I want to preface my reading by saying I'm a cowboy and a poet. I got the honor of reading with Tom Kerlin and Jerry Warren and Doc Stovall, the Booth Western Heritage Museum. But this poem I'm starting with, I wrote when I was working on my master's in lit at Clemson University. Go Tigers. It's also the first poem I got published, and hard to be, send this one off to your parents to be proud when you hear the last line. The father of a horse. Almost 4 years ago, I fertilized a mare named Invested Pine Miss with shipped semen from Texas to Raleigh. All my arms up to a shoulder in a mare, and I can't find the sweet spot because the long end at the end, the long straw at the end of the syringe slips off my forefinger and doesn't want to go into the spot. In a random manner, my fingers circles, searching for the place where a man and a mare can make a horse. It's a beautiful thing. It really is. When an equine and a Homo sapien come together in artificial insemination, without a glove, I would have been much quicker. I'm going to read a couple poems from my first book about this great character named Dick Van Pelt, who I broke a lot of horses for every year in Laramie, Wyoming. Every time I hung out with him, he was saying better poetry than I was writing when I was working on my MFA. So I tried to pay attention. The first one I want to read is called Trail Riding. We walked with a drape in our rein, our horses half dictating the path past yucca, flowering yellow, and dust out by the Red Buttes south of Laramie. He said I should try keeping my hands off the reins, avoid cueing the colt, even with rowel jingle. Just think about it. Think about moving with 4 legs you never had but wanted. Think about weaving around the prairie dog holes and outcroppings of sandstone. Think turn. Think wait. Think each hoof back to the barn. This next poem is my most published poem. And I feel honored it's in the Nebraska anthology. Besides some of my heroes like Ted Kuzer and Bill Clefcorn and Willa Cather and Twyla Hansen, Ben Gottschall, these Nebraska poets, John Neihart, these people who kept poetry alive in the plains of our country. This poem's called The Price of Hay's Gone Up Terribly. Van Pelt offers me a refill of coffee, which I accept, and he pours for me. Well, he says that 2 semis of hay will be in later this week, and the truckloads are getting steeper from Nebraska Hayfield to Baylor to Loader to Interstate Hauler to here. He asks how many spoons of sugar I take. The second spoonful spills as he dumps it in, and the white sugar salts the black rim of my mug. The banker in him knows it, hates it, but the worst of the herd must go to pay for the best. He asked what I'm doing Wednesday, and if I wouldn't want to haul a stock trailer of brood mares to meet up with a slaughter rig headed south in the afternoon. A few drops drip on his boot and onto the burnt sienna of the Spanish tile. The spill washes the sugar off the rim of my mug and leaves a ring on the table when he sets it down. I tell him I can't do it Wednesday and ask him how many he's taken. He says a full load of broodmares, which I know is 9. He folds in his bottom lip to chew on it after a sip from his cup, thinking what could have been 18 is going to be none. A 45 is behind glass in a red velvet shadow box above the center window of the breakfast nook. From this spot, the horses below the hill can't see us, but they are neighing now and pawing their feeders like they do every morning about this time. These are the degrees of market and mammal, and we watch our moon drop on its full days like a projection. So crystalline each crater is our lost face. The pistol behind its glass case like a rose, oily and honed, hangs because there's another, one that's been fired, a smoky brother, the loaded gun under the truck seat. I had to quit drinking sugar in my coffee. Cavities. I'm going to read a couple poems from my next book. I got a grant from the Wyoming Arts Council to do some research on the station logs from Pony Express stations. And specifically, there were several writers who kept pretty good notes along the way. It's kind of a fascinating tale of, it's how we got the telegraph and ultimately turned about $5 a piece of mail to about 5 cents over 16 months. The first poem I'm going to read from that is called All of Size. When the children grow all of size, damn near everything gets easier. Not only can they clutch bucket and bridle, but also hammer and rifle. Little fingers deadly as cold on quick triggers in the rock-raised pit 6 strides from the cabin. The butter is churned. The pig skinned, wood split, water drawn. Fire arrows have been flying all evening, so we don't sleep. And we pray over hot water and bread with fresh butter. Imagine the lit arrows to be only lightning bugs. But by now the little ones are good at drawing out the fat. I'm going to read the title poem from my next book. It should be out soon. You'll be able to find it on Amazon. It's coming out through Logan House Press. Thanks to the Wyoming Arts Council and Logan House. This poem's called First Pony Out. It's about the first Pony Express pony, Sylph, who ran to the first station, Kickapoo. So first pony out. Sylph, you are all ears, certain the hooplaws for you when mayor and majors talk about the length of the oxbow, the necessity for a central route. Butterfield held messages an easy fortnight every pass until the southern stations were raided and burned by natives willing to dismount and finish anything with a knife. On the eve of the first ride, the amassed crowd plucked hair from your California ponytail until you threatened to kick the next yanking arm slap off. The crowd plucked still. For luck to the parcel, 20 pounds of tissue-thin paper wrapped in oily silk to keep the notes clear of bleeding ink. When the mail swims across rivers and their tributaries, all the long way to the waiting western settlers on the short side of the mighty Rocky Mountains in the lingering ripple of the Sierras. The notes are already at steady gallop toward us, news of western gold and waiting fortune. Sylph, you will be whipped, wet with white froth and quivering in your flanks by the time we hit Kickapoo. I'm going to read a poem called Pallid. next. What I loved about the Pony Express collection is I got to imagine where I grew up, just south of Ogallala, Nebraska. I got to imagine 18-year-old kids running mail on horses across that country. Pallid. Progression of marvel. I watched the latter world and know I'm not of it anymore. 2 minutes to change horses at Town could never be fast enough. 80 orphans with 2 stout horses each would be dogged after a week straight of riding to beat the pulse of the telegraph wires, cutting Ruby Valley and Deep Creek. I gulp hot coffee at Fairmont, mercury around 0, and the horse I rode in on steams, standing there. No one has to hold him. I'm going to read 3 more. The next 2 I'm going to read are found poems. There's this gentleman named Richard M. May, who was a Pony Express rider and a fascinating individual who dug up graves along the way. And I really love the idea of a 19-year-old kid in his spare time waiting for the next run, dig up graves and rebury them just like an early archaeologist. So these are his words right out of the journal. They're all titled Found Poem, Richard M. May. Early this morning, one of the company and myself repaired to a newly thrown up mound with spade, dug 3.5 feet and found an Indian buried there. He has his implements of war and taking game in his arms, laying on his right side with his head to the north. Richard M. May, found poem, Small Mound. His head and underjaw was found entire with the most of the teeth. Dug some 5 feet and found a great many bones, and in one of the joints of his spine was a spear which had punctured to the spinal marrow. I'm going to read one more poem and then turn it over to Tom. This poem, it's from my next book called Death Benefit. This poem's called Let the Sleeping Fawn Lie. There's so much beauty in feeding like the things we care for. One of my favorite prayers my oldest daughter said when she was younger was, "Thank God for the things we care for and unicorns." I always think about that it's when I wrote this poem. Let the sleeping fawn lie. I'm not telling you there was dew sparkling on the heavy blades of grass to be poetic. My boots had split and cracked along the sole, so I looked down to wiggle my wet toes, and there she was. The sun was up but just. The fawn, curled frozen, Danished herself between sand blue stem and prairie cordgrass. Young, vulnerable in my own field, I fed a grazing pair of sorrel mares, and their chestnut babies returned, scooped up the fawn. I was almost to the barbed wire when I knew that her mother would never come back for her. That my smell, the finger oil and lurk of me would keep her away. Standing there, I hoped her mother had been killed, with short pain, by a passing cattle hauler with a pipe Bambi slammer or a rifle or some other wandering lion. I left her beneath an elderberry bush, imagined her soggy legs would lope her to the shadow of cedar and later bur oak shedding their branches in growth for no one to see, climbed through the barbed wire and only looked back when I couldn't see her.
Awesome. Thank you, Sam. We so appreciate having you on tonight. That was really great. We're going to bring you back at the end again for a quick little discussion. Can you tell us again where we can get your book, though?
Yeah, you should be able to find it on Amazon or at loganhouse.com. Books are heavy. Logan House Press.
Awesome, awesome. Well, great. Thank you so much, and we'll see you here in a few minutes. Um, Thank you, Sam. We're going to be bringing up next. We're going to have Tom Kerlin, who has been featured at many different cowboy poetry festivals across the nation. He's also featured in a national cowboy poetry anthology. He is featured on History Worth Saving. And they say about him, his whole life he's been guided by the code of the American West. He's ridden the range, served his country and his community by wearing the badge, and he's honorably worked jobs to feed his family that wouldn't have been his first choice. No matter where he's been or what he's doing, he's lived his life as an American cowboy, and that makes Tom Kerlin history worth saving. And so we're excited to invite Tom here to the stage. Hey, Tom, how are you?
I'm doing good.
Good. Well, I'm going to get off the stage because I cannot wait to hear your words. We're excited to have you here.
Thank you. I started writing poetry back in the early 90s. Just started putting down some things that I remembered when I cowboyed out in Wyoming. Some of it's pure history. Others are random thoughts in my mind, and this is one. I was out at the barn one day, and I have a habit of picking up baling twine and trying to plait a little bit with it, and I started doing this, and poem hit me, and I ran in the house and wrote it down real quick. And so that's this one. It's called a pig and string marriage. Marty and me been married now on to 30 years. And I know there's been plenty of times that I brought her to tears, but truth be known, she's done her share of hurting me too. And I'm going to tell you, at times that woman can be a real shrew. It's times like this that I take my old pappy's advice. Find you something to do outside, son, and just get away from your wife. Well, I've taken his advice about 25 years back and devised me a plan to avoid that kind of spousal attack. With some baler twine, I started plaiting a 4-strand pigging string. Over one, under t'other, you keep it taut, kind of like a spring. Well, I'd plait for a while until I'd cooled down, and I'd head back in the house after she had unwound. Now, plaiting that pigging string has sure saved the day, because without it, I don't think there'd been any other way that we could have kept our marriage together and our relationship firm, although we had both agreed in the beginning we were in it for the long term. Now, I've used a pigging string to tie up a calf, or to hold something together with a hitch and a half, but to hold a man to a woman, never really knew how just plaiting a pigging string could see us through. We'd get angry and crossed up, and things would get tense. I'd just head out to the barn rather than take the offense. In time, she'd cool down, and in time, so would I, and we'd get together and talk things over and let bygones go by. So plaiting that pigging string has kept our marriage real strong. But I probably need to tell you that pigging string is now 9.5 miles long. I had a friend that I'd known since I was 14 years old, and we were pretty close. And he passed away a few years ago. But I wrote this poem kind of with him in mind. He was pretty much a confirmed bachelor. So I named this poem A Quality Wife for Pete. Pete and Slim had always been the best of friends. They'd been together since Lord knows when. They'd worked the big ranches and the small ones too, hired on as a team, worked together as a crew. They spent their lives without too much care. Heck, there was a time they roped a grizzly bear, then spent about an hour trying to turn it loose. And many's the time they drank too much cactus juice. Pete always had Slim's back, and for Slim it was likewise. They'd been friends through the lows and the highs. Well, let me tell you, they liked the girls. They'd get spruced up some weekend, take them out for a whirl, a weekend, a party, and a dance and a drinks. But when the weekend was over, it was, well, goodbye and thanks. But when Pete met Sue, he was totally overcome by love. For weeks on end, Sue was all Pete could think of. He wanted nothing more than to make her his wife, while Slim stayed committed to the single life. Oh, Slim liked women, that there was no doubt, but he looked at marriage and saw no way out. It was a contract, a promise, till death do you part. And Slim wasn't about to give no woman his heart. He was a cowboy. He rode for the brand and stood by his word. So taking a woman for life was just totally absurd. But Pete married Sue and committed for life. And he was a devoted husband who loved his new wife. Still take no woman to come between these two friends. They'd been together through the thick and the thin. But one day they were out on the prairie rounding up strays when Slim said, "Pete, I noticed you ain't been yourself these past days." That's when Pete picked up his reins and pulled up his horse and said, "You know, Slim, I think I'm gonna have to get me a divorce." Well, Slim noticed his friend was desperately fighting back tears. "You know," said Pete, "Sue hadn't said a word to me in almost 2 years." Well, Slim thought of his friend, considered his plight, chose his words carefully, wanted them to come out just right. "You know, Pete, you might ought to think about this and possibly change your mind, because a woman like that is really hard to find." I wrote a poem a few years back, a Christmas poem. I realize it's not even Halloween yet, but all the Christmas decorations are out in the stores around here, and I suppose they are up in South Carolina too. So I'm going to do this one. And this poem was published in the Western Horseman a few years back in one of their Christmas editions. I call it Shorty's Last Christmas. Shorty was a bachelor, about 60 years old. Some say when he was born, they broke the mold. He was raised up a cowboy, just like his dad. Boots and hats were his fare. They weren't no fad. But once a year, he'd lay them aside and don a red hat and a beard for the coming Yuletide to play Santa to all the kids that he knew. Every Christmas Eve, he was there, right on cue. For weeks, he'd been sniffing out clues from their folks. Still, he listened intently to each bright-eyed cowpoke and then pulled with a flourish a new rope or a doll, every present on every list. Santa Shorty knew all. Then with a wave to the left and a nod to the right, Santa Shorty would just disappear into the night. Then last December, when Christmas was nigh, Shorty passed on to God's range up in the sky. See, even cowboys can't refuse when St. Peter bids, but who had the heart to explain to the kids? They tried to prepare the youth for the truth, but little ones don't savvy while still in their youth. So with hearts hanging heavy and eyes tinged with red, the Christmas Eve party became something to dread. When Christmas Eve came and the folks gathered round at the church meeting hall on the outskirts of town, they wondered just what the reaction would be when there was no ho, ho, ho Santa sitting there under the tree. But just after dark, with the last carol sung, there was a jingle of bells and the side door was flung, and a jumble of red on a strong wind from Montana blew in a guy who looked just like Santa. The children all screamed, and much to their delight, Santa opened his bag on that magical night. When he finished, he got up from his chair, danced across the floor, turned with a flare, and with a wave to the left and a nod to the right, said, "Ho, ho, ho, Merry Christmas, and to all a good night." When he had gone, the grown-ups just wondered just who was this Santa, and how had he blundered from out of the cold into their Christmas Eve bash, and from where came those toys he had hid in his stash. But when they went to the door to look for his tracks, not a footprint was seen, just an empty old sack. They picked up that bag and were just barely able to read Shorty printed inside on the label. Now, I'm not saying that Shorty came back, but someone or something left that empty old sack. And to this day, on the plains of Wyoming, they talk of that Christmas when someone came running from out of the cold to their Christmas Eve night and then disappeared without leaving a track in sight. Do miracles happen? I don't know what you believe. I only know what I saw on that special Christmas Eve. I got one. Sam was, I wasn't really planning on doing this one, but Sam said something about trail riding, and I picked this one up while he was on on the air. I wrote this poem that Doc Stovall, good friend of mine who passed away several years ago and actually got me into performing cowboy poetry, said he didn't like this poem because cowboys don't trail ride. And that's probably true. But sometimes after we get away from cowboying and we get married and our wife wants to go trail riding, there comes a time when you just give in and say, okay, that's fine. So this is called The Reluctant Trail Rider. I think it was just a couple of years ago that my wife said to me, there's something you need to know. Now, you ride cutting horses, and that's all right with me, but riding them cutters is not what suits me to a T. And I go with you on weekends because that's what wives do, but I want to spend time riding my horse too. Well, honey, I said, you can always turn back. That's not what I'm talking about, she said. This is not about picking up your slack. I want to ride trails, just me and my horse. And I expect you to come along and show absolutely no remorse. Now, honey, you know I ride working horses, and I have been for years. I've rodeoed and worked ranches, dragging calves and roping steers. I know you know I love you, but riding trails is not my cup of tea. Well, it's like this, she said. I go with you, so you should go with me. Wow. Have you ever noticed that a wife knows how and when to cut you real deep and slap you up real thin? I was reduced to no argument, and I had to admit that she was probably right. So right then, I had to commit. A couple of weeks later, we loaded up the horses and left to go riding trails, just me and herself. We found us a campsite, gathered us some wood. She looked around and said, now, isn't this good? Tomorrow morning, we'll eat breakfast and go out riding trails for a couple hours or so. That night until bedtime, I pondered my fate. I wondered what she'd do if we just got up late. But wouldn't you know it, she was up to crack of dawn. She jerked off the covers and said, get up and come on. We fixed up the fiddles and saddled our steeds to off-riding trails just to satisfy her needs. At first, I was bored, thinking of all the things I had to do. And then I saw a whitetail and a turkey or two. It was peaceful and quiet, and I knew I couldn't hide just how much I was enjoying this calm weekend ride. We rode for 2 hours, but it seemed more like one, and we got back to the campsite, and she says, now, wasn't that fun? I had to admit that, as usual, she was right, as we sat down for lunch and grabbed us a bite. A couple hours later, we rode out again and enjoyed our togetherness because we were really the best of friends. Now, it's a few years later, and I still ride them cutters. And that's what I'd do if I had my druthers. But I have to admit, I have a new hobby in life. I'm a trail rider too, thanks to my wife. I do write most of my poems. I repeat a few at Waddy Mitchell and Bruce Kiskadden. But there was a good friend of ours and a good friend of Cowboy Poetry. He wrote a book called Georgia Cowboy Poets several years ago, and I was honored to be part of that. David never considered himself a cowboy poet, but he did write a poem. And I told him when I saw it, when he wrote it, I said, I'm going to commit that to memory. And I'm going to do that for you every time. Unfortunately, David passed away with cancer about 4 years ago. We lost a good friend with Cowboy Poetry, and I do this thing in remembrance of him and what he meant to me and Cowboy Poetry in Georgia. And this is called Genesis 1, If a Cowboy Poet Had Wrote the Bible. At first, when God was fixing to make everything that is, when all was null and void, a formless dark abyss, a wind from God was blowing across the vast expanse, and God said, be light, and light was, as if by happenstance. Whatever light was before light was, had ears and understood God speaking into being, and God saw that the light was good. So from the darkness, God had separated light. He called the light day, and for the record, called the darkness night. And morning came, and evening, in their customary way. That's the way things came to pass on the world's first day. Then God looked down on earth with such an artful eye and said, let a dome appear. Well, let the dome be sky. And like before, as soon as it was said, it came true. A dome appeared. God called it sky, and he painted it pure blue. And morning came, and evening, in their customary way. And that's the way things came to pass on the world's second day. Then God looked down on earth with such an artful eye and said, excuse me. Then God looked down on earth and things were looking kind of wet. The waters covered everything. There weren't no dry land yet. Then God said, now let the waters be corralled up in their place and let dry land appear on earth's inundated face. And the waters were rounded up into what we call seas, and dry land appeared. And God said, let there be plants and trees. And God saw that the trees and the plants and the land were very good indeed. And morning came, and evening, in their customary way. And that's the way things came to pass on the world's third day. Then God said, now let there be lights to ride across the sky, to mark the seasons and the years as the days go crawling by, and also to give light to all the earth. And it was so. The heavenly lights up in the sky began their steady glow. The big bright light we call the sun shone out to rule the day, and softer lights, the moon and stars at night, to hold their sway. And morning came, and evening, in their customary way. And that's the way things came to pass on the world's fourth day. Then God stirred the seas corralled within earth's peaceful shores, as if their sheer tranquility cried out for something more. And God said, now let the waters teem with life. And it was so. The waters churned and bubbled, and within them life did grow. And fish and every swimming thing filled rivers, lakes, and seas. And birds flew across the sky and nested in the trees. And morning came, and evening, in their customary way. And that's the way things came to pass on the world's fifth day. So now all kinds of living creatures moved about the seas, but on dry land, the only life was flowering plants and trees. Then God said, now let living creatures occupy the ground. And suddenly the land was filled with cattle all around. Mountain goats and marmots filled rocky hills and crags, and forest teemed with lions and bears and antelopes and stags and rattlesnakes and everything that creeps upon the land. Moose, elk, wolf, and coyotes too, all made by God's own hand. Thus every breed of varmint filled the meadows and the woods, and God saw that everything on earth was looking real good. Now all that was created had turned out like God had planned, but he wasn't quite through populating the dry land. Then God said, now in our image, let us make the human race, and let them be the ones to rule creation in our place. And so in God's own image, with the utmost care and skill, male and female humankind were created by God's own will. Then God blessed the man and woman, speaking loud and clear. God said, be fruitful, multiply, and rule the creatures here. For food, God gave the yield of every kind of plant and seed, and everything that God had created was just as good as it could be. And morning came, and evening, in their customary way. And that's the way things came to pass on the world's sixth day. And so in just 6 days, God had finished crafting all creation and rested on the seventh day and made a declaration that henceforth the seventh day should be a day of rest, a day to think of holy things and know that we are blessed. So if you look up at the stars all twinkling in the sky, or out across the prairie as the wind goes howling by, and wonder where it came from, just recall this little story. There's just one thing left to say. To God be all the glory. When people see my boots and hats, they ask if I'm from Texas. I usually just say no, but what I really want to ask is, have you ever heard of Wyoming? It's one of those western states. It's even got a cowboy right there on its license plate. A fella riding a bucking horse and fanning with a hat. Now, what more could say cowboy than an image that looks like that? But I'm a cowboy from the South, and I make no apologies for that. It's where I was born and raised, and it's where I hang my hat. It's true I wasn't born out west, and from my accent, everyone knows it. But Wyoming is my second home, and it's special because I chose it. Because I went west to Wyoming when I was just a teen, and there I learned roping and branding and everything in between. I was accepted by my friends as just one of the boys and seen by strangers as a regular cowboy. From pitching hay to riding broncs, I tried to make my mark. I earned my pay as I worked each day from sunup till nearly dark. I proudly wore my boots and hats to show my occupation. I was a real cowboy, a symbol of our great nation. I tell everyone who would listen, 'twas in the South I was raised, but it's out west in Wyoming where I finally came of age. And it's there I grew to manhood, and there my heart remains, anchored to the mountains and the land we call the Great Plains. Let me do one more. I'm gonna have to read this one. I wrote this one not too long ago. A friend of mine that performs with me, Jim Dorsett, lives up in North Georgia, and he and I both have a friend named Gary Townsend, and Gary Townsend cowboyed out west, out in Colorado. And Jim was with him one day working some cows, and Gary made a offhand remark. That remark got filed away in Jim's head. He told me later, I filed it away and then wrote a poem about it. The poem's called Don't Hurry the Sun.
It looks like we have lost Tom. So I'm going to see if I can get him back on to finish his poem. He seems to have disappeared from the stream. But thank you all for joining us tonight. We are going to have a little brief discussion of cowboy poetry here in just a second. Here's Tom back.
I don't know what happened.
Great. We lost you for a minute. Do you want to start that one over?
Yeah, I will. I do a poem. I don't know that night. I do a poem about cowboy technology, and that's exactly what happens right there. Everything just goes crazy all of a sudden.
You're doing great.
Yeah,
So I'll get off stage and let's hear that again.
Okay. It's called Don't Hurry the Sun. The sun was beating down, and it was bone thirsty dry as we worked and sorted cattle one hot day in July. A windbreak of trees lined the corral to the west, and I said to my partner, about half in jest, we'll get a little shade once the trees hide the sun. Gary gazed at the sky, shielding his eye with his Stetson. I wasn't quite sure just what it was he did see. He never smiled. He wiped his brow, and he looked straight at me, and from years of garnered wisdom said, don't hurry the sun. It won't be that long for this day will be done, and then it'll be back to the bunkhouse to eat and retire before another day starts on this small cattle empire. I passed off his remark, filed it away in my head. Those words lingered on what Gary had said. As years passed by, I've often thought of that day long ago when my friend offered wisdom to a young vaquero. As I've drifted through life from one place or another, I found myself wondering when the day would be over. And I remind myself of those ancient old words told by a cowboy as we sorted pairs from the herd. Don't be in such a rush to hurry the sun. This day and the next all too soon will be done. Years pass by and life goes away much too early. So don't ask the sun to go away in a hurry. It's the same way with life as the years pass you by. You hurry through days and forget time can fly. As your age marches forward and life goes on, you can remember that saying, don't hurry the sun. For this one life on earth is all that you get. This ain't no rehearsal, so don't hedge your bet. Because life passes by and it's over too soon. So don't hurry the sun when it's just afternoon. Okay, Kimberly.
That was great, Tom. I so enjoyed that.
Thank you.
Really wonderful. Let me ask you, how did you transition from being a cowboy into being a cowboy poet?
It's a long story, but the short version is I developed a love for photography while I was cowboying. And when I was 30 years old, I decided to come back south and settle down and get a regular job. And photography led me in the newspaper business. And the funny thing is, the guy that I was taking pictures for the newspaper to kind of promote my business, he asked me to come and work for him. And I told him I didn't want to be a newspaper photographer. And he said, that's all right. I want you to write. And I said, I don't know how to write. He said, that doesn't matter. So the idea that he could teach me how to write, and he did. And I won a few awards, Associated Press, Georgia Press Association thing. I worked for him for a while, and then I had also worked for a daily paper, and I was a managing editor there. And during the downtime at the paper, I just get on the computer and write. I just take some stories that I knew from out west, the things that had happened to me, and put them down in rhyme. And I had been doing that several years. And a friend of mine told me about the Booth Western Art Museum in Cartersville. And I went up, met Doc Stovall there, and he encouraged me to get up on stage. And I was scared to death, but I got up anyway. And so that's how he wound up doing it.
Awesome. I love that. I love that. I'm going to bring Sam on because
Good.
I would love for y'all to talk a little bit about what is cowboy poetry, if people aren't familiar with it.
Well, we have a fellow who's called the father of Georgia cowboy poets, Joel Hayes. Joel just passed away a couple of weeks ago. But Joel said one time, he said, "Well, if a cowboy says a poem, it's a cowboy poet." But I'm not sure. I'm not sure that definition
seems
is,
accurate.
but it's close.
Out.
Yeah.
That's pretty good.
Yeah, but I think that it's just a way to get tales across. It developed back in the 1800s, and people sitting around campfires, especially because they had no entertainment, and that's some guy could tell a story and make it rhyme and make people laugh, and that's where I think a lot of it got started.
Yeah, the oral tradition. That's great. Sam, what about you?
You know, for me, it's a way to just carry on stories that have been told, and I think it's going to become more and more of that. Jerry has a poem that I committed to memory, and it's funny how that changes you as a poet when you take in cowboy poetry, kind of more than anywhere else in poetry. You're encouraged, like Tom would absolutely like. We can memorize another poet's work and recite it and give credit. When you do that, it changes the way you write the next time, and I think that's really valuable. I also like that there's less pretension. Typically in cowboy poetry, it's more accessible from my perspective. I think the traditional rhyme scheme of it has appeal, but I think it also is nice just to focus on a set of images that, frankly, it has been romanticized for a century or so. And I think that's nice. Plus, I agree. I mean, that's what I said. I'm a cowboy and a poet. The first thing I ever wanted to be in life was a cowboy. So if a cowboy decides he wants to write poems, then that's cowboy poetry.
Absolutely. Now, you guys mentioned earlier some work that y'all have done with students in cowboy poetry. How do you think cowboy poetry can be a great way to, connect with young people?
Go ahead, Sam.
I was going to say, we got to judge this competition multiple years, and I always presented to high schools writing a cowboy poem or teaching someone how to write a poem. We would go to the Booth Western Art Museum and look at specific paintings and then talk through what that felt like. Put yourself in that position. Imagine how those images relate to you today. And the work that came from that was great. But, the real value is then those students taking what they wrote and memorizing it, internalizing it, and naturalizing it in the same way that you and I have on like stages for whatever kind of poem you're going to present.
Right.
To be able to give back, a piece of it becomes a part of you, even if you're not a cowboy, if you've stolen that image. And every group of students I worked with had a ball doing it. I mean, we had fun with it. There were some really great poems read there. I mean, first-rate kids that would stand up, memorize.
particularly a way to get boys to getting into poetry, because sometimes people think it's a girl thing,
Right.
One of the best ones that I can relate to is, like I said, one year during the poetry contest, we had 850 entries. And there were 3 of us that would sit down and go through those entries to get to the top 10 in like 4 categories. And you look at it, and if something didn't grab your attention right off, you just sort of laid it over to the side.
Right.
And it was one particular poem that I remember that when I looked at it, read the first 3 or 4 lines, I just kind of laid it over the side. And one of the guys, one of the other guys that was part of the judges, he somewhere about 10 minutes down the road, he said, "Have y'all seen this poem?" And he read it, and I said, "I think I saw it somewhere." He said, "This is really good." And I said, "Really?" So I went through my stack and I pulled it out. And he said, "Just get through the first couple 3 lines." And I did. And this kid had written this poem about a cattle drive, but it was using a Peterbilt truck because his dad was a truck driver. And once I got past the initial thing that I thought was not right, because I thought, yeah, right, like Cowboys stuff, and he's talking about trucks. Well, then I realized what he did, and it was a really, really good poem. He actually got to the finals, but one of the criteria at the competition was you had to commit it to memory, and you had to stand up in front of a group of people and do it from memory. He just his mind just went blank up in front of everybody. But me being the old softy I am, I grabbed his poem and held him up there with me, and I read it for him, and so it was really good. But it was a great poem, it really was. So I think that's what we do. If we can, I always say, if we can just one or two kids that get interested in it, they'll help carry on the tradition, because we're literally one generation from it being gone.
Right, absolutely. And was that through like a 4-H club? Do y'all connect a little bit through?
Well, it was we were using 4-H, we were using FFA, and then we had some connection with homeschools, and then we got with teachers and in their literary classes in high school. And we would go, like Sam said, we would go to their school and we'd talk to them about what cowboy poetry was, maybe do a couple, and got them interested in doing it.
Yeah. I think that's wonderful, particularly, when you get into the more rural areas of Georgia and South Carolina, and it really gives the way for the kids to, to talk about their own personal landscapes and to kind of connect to the past, particularly, when the kids are studying like westward expansion and the settlement of the West and stuff. So I think that's really amazing. If someone was wanting to become a cowboy poet, where could they go and kind of maybe read some more or learn more about cowboy poetry? Is there like a national site or a festival that you recommend?
Elko every year.
Where?
There's a huge festival in Elko, Nevada every year.
There are several around. Like that's the big one. That's the one that everybody talks about because it's the big one. But Heber City, Utah, Prescott, Arizona, Lubbock, Texas. They have these cowboy gatherings where they have poets and singers. But you can go on YouTube and look for cowboy poetry. You can find it. You can Google it and find out about it. There are a lot of great poems done by people that are just, and Sam knows, and what I'm talking about. You read these things and you can almost see just see them there in your mind is what they are doing. So it's great. Yeah.
And I saw there was it looked like there's some sort of cowboy poetry festival that's down near the coast of South Carolina, and I think there may be. Is there still a festival in Georgia?
We have one. We have one at Booth Western Art Museum. Of course, they got canceled this year because of COVID.
Right.
We had one in February, and then we have a second one in the last of October. Okay. Both of those got canceled. So hopefully they'll be picked up again next year.
Right. Well, I'm glad we were able to at least do this cowboy poetry showcase tonight for folks in South Carolina and beyond, and kind of get the information about it's kind of a lost art form. Some people may not have heard of it, so it's really great to bring you guys both here and educate people a little bit. And Tom, I know that people can actually see you performing more if they search Tom Kerlin on YouTube and find there are some more of your poems on YouTube there that people can watch. And of course, definitely go on Amazon to get Sam's book. But if there was one more thing that you wanted people to know about cowboy poetry, what do you think that would be? What should we leave everyone with?
Go, Sam.
I'd say, don't be afraid to write your truth. And so I believe that two of the greatest things America has going for it, I mean, cowboys and rock and roll are probably on that top 5 list.
Yes.
Like the cowboy culture and spirit, I think can exist in everyone. But figuring out your truth and why that has such appeal to the American public, I mean, if you want to write cowboy poetry and focus in that way, don't feel like you have to be a cowboy, because I do think there's a spirit to that sort of writing and that sort of energy.
Yeah, we would tell the kids when we would visit their schools, we'd say, look, think of a story. Like Sam said, look at one of these paintings and see if you can imagine what was going on in that painting. Or if you know a story that your dad has told you, or your uncle's told you, or your granddad has told you, remember the story, write the story down, and then spend time just putting it together in verse with rhyme. That's the best way to do it. And I'm with Sam. When I was a little boy, just like Sam, it's amazing. All I ever wanted to be was cowboy. Really, that's what I wanted to do, and I just grew up that way. That was, I listened to Sons of the Pioneers and Marty Robbins and Frankie Lane singing Western song. That's what I wanted to do. But other than service, I told my daddy when I got out of high school, I want to go to Texas to be a cowboy, and he said no. Back then, if your dad said no, it didn't matter if you was 30, you didn't do it. So that was my thing. I could do it. Of course, it turned out good because I was going to go in service anyhow. But this has been great. I've just really enjoyed it. It's kind of strange performing to a computer. So
it is.
Yeah.
You're used to that audience interaction.
Right.
I don't know if you told you, but my background is poetry slam, which is the same thing where you memorize your poems and perform them. So it's definitely a little tough to get used to just talking to the computer. But I so appreciate y'all both coming on. This has been so fun for me, and I know the audience has really enjoyed it. We've had a great turnout tonight. And audience, we hope to see you back here next week. We're Carolina Poets every Thursday night at 7 o'clock on the Facebook page, Carolina Poets, and on our YouTube channel, Carolina Poets. So thank y'all so much for coming out. This has been really a fun night. And we'll hope to see everyone.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you very much.
I can't wait to come read poems in person with you when the world opens up. Both of you guys.
I know.
It is interesting. I will value forevermore that anxiety from crowd interaction. It's better than just not knowing what's out there.
Right. That is true. I mean, I definitely miss seeing all my poetry friends on the stage with them. So this has been really great. Well, great. I'm going to go ahead and end our broadcast, and we'll see everybody next Thursday.
Thank you.